Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a show that packages high-impact philosophical insights for easy consumption by aspiring members of the professional managerial class. This week's episode is on James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution, written in 1941. In this book, Burnham, an at the time recovering Trotskyite, laid out his theory of the already underway transition from capitalism to managerialism. This process, according to Burnham, was most advanced in Bolshevik Russia and Nazi Germany, although the United States of America, under New Dealism, was also moving towards being a society in which managers, rather than capitalists, controlled the means of production. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon and have weekly chats with subscribers about our most recent episodes. I've also published a novel called Tower, if you're interested in hearing more from me. And finally, we have a Discord server for this podcast, on which you can find Levi, myself, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is once again in the show notes. So if you want to know what people mean when they keep talking about the PMC, then listen on. Enjoy.
Do you think we might start off by discussing, or asking a question why are we reading the Managerial Revolution? Or why did you want to do the Managerial Revolution?
So I've read two books by James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution and The Machiavellians. Machiavellians was at your suggestion. Managerial Revolution was because I think I listened to Mark Andreessen in a podcast talking about the Managerial Revolution, and he made it sound really interesting. And as I've come later to learn, Mark Andreessen often references books which, upon reading them, makes me wonder whether he's actually read them. For example, he was referencing at one stage Meltdown by Nick Land as a reason to be optimistic about the future of technology, which is it's a courageous interpretation of Nick Land's picture of the future. I'll give him that.
Right.
Similarly, having read The Managerial Revolution, I'm not sure if Mark Andreessen or a number of other people recently whom I've heard talking about this book, if any of them have actually read it. And so that's a large part of the reason why I want to talk about this book, even though I think Burnham's book, The Machiavellians, is a much better book. The Managerial Revolution is not bad. It's just there are a lot of things that stop it from being a really good book. I think you mentioned that he regarded it as a transitional text because he was a very, very committed disciple of Leon Trotsky for quite a while, for 10 years or so, wasn't it? He converted in the early 30s and left the faith in 1940 or so, wasn't it?
Yeah, about that. I think I'm not sure. I suspect it was after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I suspect that, and in particular Trotsky's response to that. I mean, so to give listeners context, James Burnham, born in 1905, of a philosophical. Actually, he was raised a Catholic, very good student. Did Princeton and I think Oxford after that. Studied medieval philosophy either at Yale or at Oxford. His first actual book was co-authored with another guy named Philip Wheelwright, which was an introduction to philosophical analysis. So he's a pretty straightforward philosopher. Not probably more in the, I guess, analytic and logic chopping domain, but with a background in medieval philosophy and very alert to continental traditions and that sort of thing. And he was also a pretty upper crust sort of guy, well off, liked to wear fancy suits and have expensive dinner parties where he played cards. And then in the 30s, he converted to, was persuaded of the merits of Marxism in general and Trotskyism in particular, and was sort of like almost a parody of a intellectual champagne socialist. He'd hang out with all his bougie friends and play cards. This particularly posh French card game, which I won't try to do the pronunciation of, and then he'd write all these intellectual, not screeds, but probably fairly considered sort of treatises, and was very involved in the Trotskyist movement, and was not, I don't think they ever met, but he was well regarded by Leon Trotsky, and Trotsky apparently regarded Burnham, as like the foremost American Trotskyist and carrier of the revolution. But I suspect after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then Trotsky's response to it, Burnham. But I suspect it was that emotionally got him to ditch Trotskyism. But in his own recollection, he has this sort of fairly detached writing style most of the time, and it's quite dry and sometimes amusing. And he just sort of said, well, at a certain point, I just discerned through logic that Marxism was incorrect, and so I changed my mind. But I think Trotsky was very angry with him after he broke with Trotsky and wrote some criticisms. I think Trotsky referred to him as a strutting bourgeois pedant. A strutting bourgeois pedant, I think was the phrase. And then apparently Burnham just dumped all of his correspondence with Trotsky in the fireplace, which is a bit of a shame. So after that period, Burnham, the reason why he refers to the Managerial Revolution as a transitional work, or that he came to regard it as a transitional work, was because it was only maybe 2 or 3 years after he broke with Marxism, that the Managerial Revolution was published, and it carries over a lot of Marxist social themes of social and economic development with it. A very sort of historically deterministic work, and Burnham would later become not really a traditional conservative, but some kind of conservative and right-winger and extremely anti-Soviet. But his later works are much more, not straightforwardly conservative, but they're much more like recognizably conservative. At this point in his career, he wasn't like any kind of conservative. It would probably be another 15 years till he got to that point. But yeah, that's why he called it a transitional work, if that context helps.
It does help a lot. He eventually transitioned to being so muscular a right-winger that he opposed any sort of containment of the Soviet Union, instead supported rolling back communism in any country it was found in.
Yeah, the third of his Cold War trilogy books published in the 1950s is called Containment or Liberation? ? And he definitely liberation. He just kept wanting to roll them back. And some people credit him with early formation of US Cold War policy, and later with inspiration for Reagan's policy. But probably a more convincing case for his early influence on Harry Truman's policy, because at that point he was actually quite a senior analyst in the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And that his first Cold War book evolved out of a long memo he had written in that capacity.
Was that at a time when he was writing for National Review as well? Or did his National Review days come later?
So that book was preceded National Review. So I think it was The Struggle for the World, which is the first Cold War book, was published in 1947. Then I think we had maybe 1951 for his second Cold War book, the name of which is escaping me. And then his third one, Containment or Liberation, was maybe 1950, early 50s. National Review was founded in 1955. So he immediately came on to National Review as a senior editor and wrote a weekly or bi-weekly or whatever it was, column for National Review on foreign policy, and did so for maybe 20 or 30 years. But it was after, well into his National Review career, that he was, I guess the anti-communist foreign policy came first. A bit more of the social conservatism and respect for market economics came after exposure to the right-wing ecosphere, I guess.
So, with the Managerial Revolution, one important thing to bear in mind is the circumstances under which it was written. So, like you said, it was written shortly after. I think it was published in 41, so written shortly after
Yeah.
his break with Trotsky, and also written at a time when the model of, say, Western or US capitalism really seemed to be dying. So it was at a time when Nazi Germany in continental Europe was ascendant. Fascist Italy was not collapsing yet. The Soviet Union was growing stronger. And so it really seemed that these sort of ideologies of state control were just massively outcompeting any sort of more decentralized method of allocating resources.
Yep.
And that really strongly comes through in this.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
the basic premise of the Managerial Revolution is that a change in the type of society that currently exists is currently underway in places like the United States or the United Kingdom, and has actually been completed or is in much more advanced stages of completion, like in the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Italy. And this is the rule of the managers. So he says what defines a society's type is basically the relationship of various groups to the means of production. And this is where we see the significant influence of Marxism on Burnham at this point in his life and earlier. Where he says basically a society is defined by which class has both the ability to control access to the means of production and is able to give itself preferential access to the products of the means of production. And that really defines the type of society you're in, because if you take those two things, that relationship between a given class and the means of production, and then follow the logic of that, you realize that this entails a control of whichever political process and whichever locus of sovereignty there is in a society, and it is under the control of the class which controls the means of production. Social relations within that society are going to be mediated by whichever means the ruling class uses to interface with the means of production as well. And he says that at the moment, in the United States, it's still a capitalist country because it is capitalists who both control access to the means of production and control access to the products of the means of production. And they do so by using capitalist relations of private property over the means of production, which is why the US in 1941, at the time of the publication of this book, was still a society in which capitalist relations were alive, but one in which they were being rolled back. And a large part of the beginning of this book is him saying why it's not going to be socialism that is the consequence of declining capitalism, because he was very much convinced that capitalism was strongly in decline at the point of writing. He lays out so Burnham did change his beliefs over his life, but one thing that is very much constant in Burnham is his love of lists. He just loves listing things. So he will say, here I have 7 reasons as to why socialism will not succeed capitalism, and then he'll list them out. He's he's quite easy to read in that his works are highly structured. You don't, as a reader, actually need to be working very hard to piece things together because he's done it all for you.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the precise list of points that he makes as to why socialism is not going to succeed capitalism, but his line of reasoning leading to why managerialism, which I'll get into what precisely managerialism is in a moment, will succeed capitalism, is that capitalism is inexorably in decline. And he says, for a few reasons, most saliently, massive uncontrolled unemployment, and the fact that capitalism is unable to match the large number of workers who want to work with the large number of producers who want people to help them produce things with the inability to do that.
Sorry, Jack. Sorry.
Ed just had to tend to his baby. Where
Yes.
was I? Oh yeah, why capitalism's going to fail? So
Mass unemployment.
Yeah, mass unemployment. I've heard this criticism made, particularly in Jacques Ellul, his writings, that capitalism is unable to fully employ advances in technology in the same way that a planned economy is able to.
Yeah.
Capitalism is also... this must have been the case in the 40s. He said that capitalism or capitalist countries see the accumulation of capital that is not put towards productive uses. It's just being accumulated and not spent.
Yeah.
And so Burnham said this is evidence that capitalism is unable even to coordinate capital flows anymore. I think those are the primary reasons why capitalism is on the way out. And people aren't going to be willing to fight for it.
At this point, like... Yeah. I feel like reading the sort of descriptions as to why capitalism won't work, particularly it's like theory, like just there's something. I mean, it's easier to say now because we've got retrospect, but like economists probably you and I would admire, and Levi would hyper admire. Like they would not have taken this economic analysis seriously at the time, and also like think about how short a period it was like that he's basing this mass trend off. I mean, like what the Great Crash occurred in 1929, and then he was presumably writing this book by about 1940 for publication in 1942, and he's just saying like, well, the last decade we've had chronic unemployment, and he acknowledges like the massive New Deal interventions that have occurred, and it's not like, well, maybe even if he doesn't say, as Levi adjacent economists would, that like it was the very New Deal interventions that probably prolonged the mass unemployment. It's just a big bloody assumption to just be like, well, it's been going on for a decade. It's been going for a while, so it'll go on forever. That's it. That's it for capitalism.
Because we can get into this particularly when we're talking about how well his predictions hold up in 2024. So he traces the high watermark of capitalism to 1914, basically right before the beginning of the First World War. He says it was with the First World War that managerialism really started to erode capitalism. And the observation that how capitalism operates is radically different, but say 1914 and today is, I think, quite fair.
Yep.
So capitalism is not a monolithic thing. But it hasn't died to the same extent that he said it would. He was very certain. I think he even put a time frame, like a rough time frame on it. He said, 15 to 40 years or so. It's going to be all over. Everything's going to be managerial.
Yeah, I think he said like no later. I think he said like no later than about 1960, or like no later than 15, 20 years from the point at which he was writing. Like, I mean, my interpretation is like. Is that he describes quite well how capitalists as the managers take over more control, like how capitalists will resist it, but then accommodate themselves to it and actually reap what profits they can from quote unquote partnerships with government or providing contracting services to government. But like it seems to me like there's definitely like in the broad outline you say like it's recognizable today that there is obviously like a pretty managed and managerial sort of economy, but like it's what he described as going on at the time is sort of feels like where we are in a lot of ways today. I know I'm getting ahead of it, but yeah.
And so you saying that really reminds me of the disjunction between what people who haven't read this book but talk about it, the disjunction between that view of the Managerial Revolution and what is actually in the Managerial Revolution. itself, I think a lot of the people who talk about the Managerial Revolution without having read it seem to think it is a prescient description of 2024, particularly the United States, although this very much holds for Australia as well, where, yes, you have capitalism, but to a large extent there is a separation of ownership and control, and a large amount of the market is extremely heavily regulated by administrative or bureaucratic government organizations which more or less run themselves without interference from a parliament.
Yeah.
Whereas what he's saying is much more, is explicitly that you're going to have complete state control of the economy. There will be no capitalist relations. You will have the class of managers who will be completely in control of society. His predictions are greatly at variance with at least the, I guess, popular interpretation of Burnham's predictions in this book. But I'm also getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably impossible to not get ahead of ourselves in some sense, but like part of the problem I have with it is that he predicates his whole social developmental theory is really and this is how it's stuck in the Marxist sort of framework, is that it's all about a development, not in the economic sense really, but a development of who is going to be the ruling class. Like it's so predicated on control of the means of production that he says things at times like kind of saying that like, well, of course government doesn't need to make a profit, and so it's not a concern for them. That's only a concern for the capitalists. And like I don't know, I got the sense that like he doesn't really address the problem of like what happens if a government goes bankrupt and what that might do to his theory. Like it can't just arrogate everything to itself and run at a loss all the time. You can only run a lot of government services at a loss if you're collecting sufficient revenue from the private economy.
My guess to what, say, 1941 James Burnham would say to that is that once managers have gotten rid of capitalist money relations or capitalist private property relations, then it's not really a problem whether government operates at a profit or a loss or not.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they set the prices, they set the wages, they set the production targets, etc., etc. The problem with that is you still have a resource allocation problem, which at the time seemed to be entirely soluble by central planning. But at least from the experience of the past few decades and the decades that came after this book, it became more evident that the problem of central planning is a lot harder than people initially thought it would be. Almost hard to the point of just being impossible for a single actor or a group of people.
Yeah, and I think that's why like he so much focus on it's more just like how he prioritizes things, like his prioritization of economic development versus like social development. Like he's just sort of like, if he, I don't know, like he sort of like he takes it as a historical developmental given that it is possible for people to just absolutely hold the means of production and run things at a loss. like it's a I mean, like, so if you assume that's possible, then his theory, you know, I guess works out. But like that's not possible.
It's and that's probably where the biggest problems with this book are, is the fact that he's still very much operating in the mindset of a Trotskyist.
Yeah.
But he's applying that to he's applying it to things which are quite similar to Trotskyism in many respects, but different. So he hasn't left behind Trotskyism quite yet with this book.
It might be worth exploring, as he does, the theories of like, you know, because he basically says, okay, there are three alternatives. You know, there's that everyone thinks it's either capitalism versus socialism, But really, there's capitalism versus socialism versus managerialism, and I'll show you why capitalism and socialism are destined to fail, and that leaves managerialism. So, like, why does he say socialism will fail?
So he says his account as to why socialism isn't going to arise is based on two things. So the first thing he says is that the socialist account of why socialism is inevitably coming is based on two things, and he says one of those things is very easy to argue, and the other of those things is actually very hard to argue, but is rarely explicitly argued. So the first thing that is easy to argue is what Burnham has just done in this book, that capitalism is going to fail.
Yeah.
And for the reasons I outlined, he says capitalism is going to fail, socialists agree with this, and this is easy to argue. However, socialists then assume that the only possible alternative to capitalism is socialism. And note, when I say socialism, Burnham means it very much in the Marxist sense, that you're going to have a classless society. Classless based on access to the means of production and control over the means of production.
Yeah.
And he says, look, if you look historically, there's not really anything to suggest that socialism is going to inevitably follow capitalism. He even points to the Soviet Union and says, look, in the Soviet Union, you had an initial period of workers being closer to the means of production, which is the stage of history preceding a classless society. But we then see, by the time this book was written, under Stalin, the workers were taken further from the means of production, and in fact, managers were elevated to rule over them. And we'll get into what managerialism is after this.
Yeah.
So Burnham's main argument against socialism and saying why socialism is not going to come is that he says, A, there's nothing to guarantee that inevitably it follows the demise of capitalism, and B, he then outlines managerialism and says managerialism is so much more likely, or if I'm going to be less charitable to Burnham, I'd say that Burnham basically says managerialism is inevitably going to come, which comes back to what you were saying earlier about how he's following a very much materialist, historically deterministic view of how human events will transpire.
Yeah.
In terms of managerialism... sorry, go on.
So I was just going to say, like, I mean, I found, as I recall, like, I found the critique of socialism as the socialist or the Marxist sort of theory of history is as I recall, completely sound. And, I guess he sort of goes and like compares with earlier historical periods and just sort of points out that, if you were to have a dictatorship of the proletariat, such as Marxist-Leninist theory requires, then you would actually need to have the people, or at least their delegates, the workers, getting increasingly familiar and capable with dealing with technological developments and utilizing them. But he points out that like the more technology has developed, the further and further away it's actually got from the common man, such that you do need a sufficient level of expertise to run a complex modern enterprise, to manage it. So like, and that's just, it's so much less likely today, as in 1941 or 42, than it was previously, because, it's not the case that the workers can just like even in the First World War, they could conceivably grab their weapons and turn them on their rulers. But as the weaponry has become so much more sophisticated and there's people managing like bombing from the sky and stuff like that, like you can't just overturn the ruling class with like a musket. You need to have access to the most ridiculously complex weapons if you were to do that. And those weapons are, by definition, of their complexity, in the hands of a very small group of people.
Yeah. And that was, that's right, because he also he compares the historical period of the ascent of the bourgeoisie from, he says, the roughly 14th century to 1914 was when they started declining in power,
Yep.
and saying for the bourgeoisie during that period, as new technologies arose, as new social relations arose, they were all things that benefited the power of the bourgeoisie, and particularly put the bourgeoisie in a position to more effectively control access to the means of production and more effectively control access to the outputs of the means of production, as opposed to the feudal rulers that they were in competition with. And then he says, you look at the state of the proletariat and you don't see that sort of gradual but inexorable seeming accumulation of power and drawing closer to the means of production.
Yeah, definitely. Is that all?
So
we
the people who are drawing closer to the means of production.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I was about to ask if that was all on the socialist critique, but yeah, I think you're continuing.
Yeah,
Go on.
yeah. And one thing actually with this particular critique, even so, it's too Marxist to be completely compelling to me. Some aspects of it are reasonably compelling, but something, and he did leave behind a lot of that Marxism, or basically all of it, as he grew older. But one thing he always retained was that people can behave in a certain way that goes completely counter not only to what they formally say they're doing. I think he draws this distinction more clearly in the Machiavellians than he does here, but it's still very much present. There's a difference between what people formally say they're doing, what they think they're doing, so why they think they're acting, but then the actual reasons for their action. And he'll say, with the ascent of the bourgeoisie during their time of power, he'll say almost none of them, or very few of them, would have been acting with the explicit intention of advancing the cause of capitalism or advancing their class interests. Instead, they were advancing their personal interests and unwittingly were ushering in this massive change. And similarly, with the decline of capitalism, you'll have capitalists behaving in such a way that hastens their demise and removes them from power, but they're not aware of this. They're not aware of the consequences of their actions. There's always this hidden reason behind human action, and that really seemed to persist through. It at least persisted into the Machiavellians. I'm not sure if in his very latest works it was still present or not.
Yeah. I mean, to an extent. I mean, I would say he never abandoned his preoccupation with the theory of managerialism, basically, and he never abandoned his theory outlined in the Machiavellians about, the distinction between like what he calls a political formula, which is a myth that is not in any way logically or empirically true, but nevertheless serves a particular guiding or motivating function for a society. Like he never loses that stuff. It's just that he complements it's qualified by other areas of by other disciplines, I guess. So it's qualified by his growing appreciation for free market economics. It's qualified by more of a he does abandon the historical determinism bit. He remains very interested in trends later on, but basically he retains parts of them. It's just that he adds on a whole bunch of other things which qualify what are very stark and almost monocausal explanations in the Machiavellians and in the Managerial Revolution, because they were both published within 2 years of each other too. Like, so Machiavellians was 1943.
I didn't realize the Machiavellians came so soon after this.
Yeah, so the Machiavellians was the book that he said that was almost the foundational book, because in it he sort of, I think he might explicitly renounce the historical determinism part, and so that was like a big thing for him. But it was still like at least another 17 years before he would even be identified as like a conservative, I guess. Maybe by the time he wrote Congress and the American Tradition, which is 1959, by that point he was definitely conservative. But Machiavellians was still 12 years before he joined National Review.
That's really interesting. Just because it's, at least in my mind, such a massive improvement on the Managerial Revolution, I just assumed it came quite a bit later. Because the Managerial Revolution, I don't dislike it. It's an interesting book, but I really like the Machiavellians. I think it's a really good book. The jumping quality is dramatic.
Yeah, but it's also like, if you think it was a period of pretty fast development for him, because like if a few years, like a couple of years before the Managerial Revolution, he was like a Trotskyist, and then he just abandons and rejects that. And then I take it he really took the criticisms of the Managerial Revolution seriously, and particularly, I mean, famously, there's the criticisms from George Orwell, which he knew of and I think respected. But also, like, the war was probably would have started turning by, because the Managerial Revolution was published before or just before America got into the war. And he would have seen that the war was probably going the other way as well, which had different implications for his theory of, like, you know, how great Germany was, or how successful it was likely to be. So it was the Machiavellians is still an early work. It's just that he regarded it as like the turning point for him of his serious work. You know, in whatever stock you put in an author's assessment of when their first serious work was.
Okay, so now, probably almost an hour in, it's time for me to actually talk about who the managers are in the Managerial Revolution.
Yep.
Who is the coming ruling class? So, a good way to illustrate what precisely Burnham means by managers is to talk about his idea of the 4 groups of people who have some connection to the means of production under 1940s capitalism. And bearing in mind, these 4 groups of people represent a very small portion of the total population. So you've got the vast majority of the population, the masses, are just going to get stomped on by anyone.
Yep.
And you've got these 4 groups at the top of a capitalist society who have some relationship to the means of production. So the first of these are technical managers. So in the running of a company, for example, these are the people who are product managers, engineers, people like that. Their job is to either coordinate the company itself, coordinate resources within the company so that it is able to make stuff, or to coordinate the actual production of stuff.
Yeah.
So you got the managers. Then you've got finance managers, and what these people do is they make sure the company operates at a profit. And so they're not essential, at least in Burnham's telling, to making sure that things get made. Their job is to make a profit, is specifically to focus on capitalist property relations, to make sure that you can produce something and then sell it back into the market for more money than you bought the raw materials for.
Yep.
Then you've got finance capitalists, and these are basically speculators. So they buy and sell companies or stocks in companies as commodities. They're not doing it because they're terribly interested in the means of production or producing things. They're just making money off it. Then finally, you've got stockholders. And these are people who own, in inverted commas, a portion of a company and are entitled to perhaps getting a dividend on that, or selling that stake in the company, hopefully for more money than they bought it for.
Yep.
I say own in inverted commas because Burnham is very clear that he considers control to be ownership. He says if you own on paper but don't control something, you really don't own it in any meaningful sense.
Yeah.
So you've got these 4 groups, and Burnham says that managerialism is going to be that first group of people, the production managers and engineers, getting more and more and more control of society, and eventually society will be changed into one in which this group of people is the ruling class. And that's underway, he said, all over the world. It's most advanced in Russia, but the fascist world was catching up as well. And the United States, under New Dealism, was beginning down the path of managerialism as well. He said the finance managers are not going to be important in the future because you're not going to have those capitalist money relations. So their job of making sure that a company or a government is profitable is just, it's not going to be a consideration.
Yeah.
Finance capitalists who under capitalism are the highest paid and the most powerful people are also not going to have any power because they don't actually control the means of production. They only control the capitalist private property relation over it, which is going to be meaningless once the managers are in control. And then finally, the stockholders, who were never very powerful to begin with, or never had any real power, are going to be even more powerless.
Yeah, it's
so
sort of
is
like...
that
yeah.
Is that a reasonable account of who managers are?
No, that is a reasonable account, but it just occurs to me as you were saying it, like, because he defines ownership as like, control over the means of production as well as preferential treatment in the output of that production, and he's sort of like, doesn't it occur to him that like the stockholders, by receiving a dividend in the company, are receiving some kind of preferential treatment in like the output of the company? Like he sort of like, he kind of glosses over that. It's like, okay, but yes, you're right. That's as I recall.
My read on that was basically that they're getting preferential treatment to some sort of output of the company, but it's
not
contingent upon those who truly control the means of production allowing them to have it.
Yeah.
I guess that was me reading between the lines, but you're right. He doesn't explicitly address it.
Yeah. No, that is part of his assumed theory and therefore consistent.
Yeah. And so what managerialism is it's basically, it's a few things. So it was Burnham acknowledging that social enterprises like, under capitalism, companies that are producing things, but under managerialism or some sort of more centralized system, perhaps government bureaus organizing the production of things, the operation of increasingly more technically complex objects, whether for the purposes of production or for war or for communication, for anything like that, these things are just getting more and more complex, are requiring more and more people to be part of their production and their operation. And as you get larger numbers of people, you need something to coordinate them. And that coordinating function falls to managers. And so Burnham did correctly make the observation that managers were becoming increasingly important in the function of government and the function of production. And from this, a combination of that observation and his belief that ultimately whoever is in control of something truly owns it, led him to believe that the managers of the world were only going to become more powerful, control more of society, and would eventually completely push capitalism out of their way. Capitalism as this chaotic system which really got in the way of effective, stable management.
Yep.
And a managerial state is... So he has a chapter where he draws some distinction between totalitarianism and a managerial state, which was a bit... For me, when he acknowledged that government bureaucrats would have effectively be managers themselves, they're just managing some sort of government bureaucratic function, rather than, for example, an engineering managing some particular aspect of the manufacture of cars. That felt to me as an acknowledgement that a managerial society would effectively be a totalitarian society.
Yeah.
I actually struggled to appreciate how he distinguished between managerialism and totalitarianism.
I actually, honestly, I can't offer any help there. I don't recall at all. I don't recall at And I don't have the book near me.
Well, I was just thinking of this in the context of what does a managerial economy and society look like? And it really is one where if you imagine a society where you don't have a free market interfering with managerial economic plans. It's a government and society where every aspect of production is not left open to the chance of the market. It's instead all meticulously planned by managers who are not only effective in their own particular brand of management, but are also being subtended by a deepening understanding of the theory of management in general. So not only are managers in particular fields getting more effective, but the idea of management itself is being scientifically developed.
Yeah.
And they will offer economic plans, so 2-year or 5-year plans in the economy. Individual citizens will be allocated some of the outputs of the means of production in return for their labour. And this is where he says that it's not going to be a socialist society because it's very much going to be class-based and based on class exploitation, because you will have this class of the managers who will award themselves a great or a disproportionate share of the products of production.
Yep.
As compared to other classes. So the society of managers is really, I guess it's the Soviet system, but pushed much, much further. It's interesting too, looking at where he has this section where he talks about sovereignty and where sovereignty is located. And he says it's important to see in societies where sovereignty is symbolically located. And sovereignty for a group, I should give his definition, where he says a group is sovereign if it makes and applies its own laws to itself and does not recognize the laws imposed on it by any group outside of itself.
Yeah.
And this sovereignty of a group is often symbolized in a building or some sort of place. He says, for example, with bourgeois capitalism, parliaments are oftentimes the concrete symbolism of their self-sovereignty.
Yeah.
And he says parliaments, because they're slow and deliberative, worked fine under capitalism because the market keeps functioning without them when they're just sitting around and talking and not managing. But in a managerial economy and a managerial politics where basically everything needs to come as an order or a command from somewhere else, a parliament is simply not going to function. And he says that the loci of sovereignty are going to be basically bureaucratic administrative bodies. So instead of a parliament, you're going to have the central bank, the Department of Agriculture, etc., etc.
Yeah,
and he also
the parliament is like the in his historical analysis, and I think it's the same as in Marx. The parliament, is the historical interpretation is that the rise and dominance of parliament is in effect part of the bourgeois revolution and is not analogous to, but equal with the basically the rise of the merchants to power, like the lower house of the House of Commons, the lower house in the United States, are represent the merchant interests, and at the time they were, they took over from like the upper house. Let's say in the United Kingdom, the upper house is the House of Lords that represents a landed and aristocratic interests, but dominance shifted, or the loci of power shifted to the House of Commons, which is the merchants. But then it'll shift to if it's shifting to the managerial class, that will be exercised through the executive. And so the parliament will be basically abolished or fade away.
Yeah. He also does locate sovereignty within the whichever governing body there is of the ruling single party in a country.
Yeah, right.
So he locates it, say, in the Bolshevik Party in the Soviet Union, in the I forget what NSDAP stands for, but in the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany.
Yep.
So he does acknowledge that it's going to be basically you're going to be ruled by Vic Roads and a single party, and
Yeah.
he also says actually it's likely to be materially more prosperous than a capitalist country or than a capitalist parliamentary democracy, but
yeah,
he also points out that it doesn't mean that this is going to be a utopia. He says that so you're not going to get the sort of stock market crises of capitalism. Instead, you're going to get managerial crises, which is basically just people making bad plans. And I found that he says it very dryly, so I'm not sure if it's a joke or not. I just find it very funny, the acknowledgement that things will still go wrong because someone's going to fuck the 5-year plan up at some point.
yeah. I think I was just thinking like circling back to the distinction between managerialism and totalitarianism. I mean, would it be the case from his point of view that totalitarianism only occurs when you've got basically when the ruling class is trying to get ahead of a historical trend, if not go against it? Like they actually have to force it upon people, whereas in his vision, it's just inevitable. So it won't need to be forced on people to the same extent because it is just how things are going to work. If that distinction makes sense, like once you get to
I think you're right with that.
You'll transcend totalitarianism, or you won't have the need for it because you're not forcing people reluctantly to do it, or you're not in advance of the historical trend. Let alone going against it.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, in the sense that you don't have to cajole a particular a cog in a machine to be where it is. It simply turns in place based on the mechanical forces around it.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I think that is the distinction between totalitarianism and managerialism. So, in terms of managerial states, he says that the most advanced is Russia because under Stalinism particularly, the managers are really, really strongly in control and are deepening their control in Russia. He says in Nazi Germany, it is behind Russia. There are still remnants of capitalist opposition, but by the early 1940s, those had really been smashed. They were greatly weakened and were definitely on the way out. The more interesting case is when he's talking about the United States, and I suppose it makes sense that it's a more interesting case because that's where he was from. He understood much more about that country than Russia or Germany or the Soviet Union. And so he sees New Dealism as an inevitable and primitive manifestation of the coming managerialism. And he says that it's important not to confuse the New Deal with Roosevelt because he says that I think he says Roosevelt doesn't even contribute 10% to New Dealism because New Dealism is coming about because of historical forces.
Yeah.
And he basically says New Dealism it's anti-capitalist because it's pulling more and more power away from the market, away from individual capitalists who are already losing power and have lost a lot of real actual power because while they formally own the means of production, that is to say they own stakes in companies that are producing, they're getting further and further away from the actual production of things. They delegate to managers, whether these people are, say, engineers on the factory floor or these are chief executive officers or someone else in the C-suite who doesn't actually own the company necessarily, but is managing it in the place of the group of people who notionally own it. So you've got that plus increasing managerial control in alphabet agencies over the market as was coming about in the New Deal that Burnham saw as really the early stages of the death of capitalism in the United States. And it's interesting him talking about that because aspects of how he described New Dealism is probably closer to what ended up happening to capitalism than it totally melting away into an absolute system of managerial techniques. Instead, the trajectory in the US really seemed to be much more of an increasing amount of government control of private markets, and not parliamentary control or not congressional control, but rather control of markets by unelected managerial agencies. So in seeing that trend, he did get something right. He did predict something that still largely holds in 2024. Where he went wrong is he saw New Dealism as this transitional stage to the Vic Rhodesization of everything in society.
Yeah, and to be fair, like, it was a the trend line was sort of pretty dramatic. I mean, like,
oh yeah,
I have these vague numbers in my head, but like, I think around, in like Theodore Roosevelt's administration, like around when he took office, maybe like the early 1900s, government spending as a percentage of GDP was still well under 5%, and I think like more around like 1, 2, 3%. And by the time of the New Deal, it would have been up well into the, like, let's say 1935 was probably up until like the 40s or 50s, and then in the Second World War, like 70%. So like, it was a pretty dramatic thing, and he just sort of assumed that would go up to 100%. But really, and today it's probably like 45, 50% in the US, which is, so it's, as you say, it's still around like that. It feels very much like his description of the New Deal.
And it's part of the reason why the historical context of this book is so important, because like you said, these predictions given when he was writing are not that absurd. So sure, you can disagree with the historical determinism that he describes as the mechanism behind it, but when he was alive, the totalitarian states of, say, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, the empire of the Soviet Union were really ascendant. And this was at a stage when Nazi Germany had just completely demolished France, was bombarding the United Kingdom. It wasn't unreasonable to believe that form of government was going to be the dominant form of government.
Yeah, and I think it's I think part of the, like, the real distinction, like, between like the earlier and the later sort of Burnham, after he's been a bit chastened by history and his own life, is just like his training in like theology. His main training was like in theology and logic and Marxism, and like, the theology and the Marxism all have a progressive or millenarian sort of historical view. So he was just completely projecting straightforward or straight in one direction.
Yeah. I didn't know about the theology, but that makes a lot of sense.
I think in Thomist Catholic philosophy. Oh no, it was medieval philosophy. Yeah.
Correspondence is huge. Yeah.
Although he was an atheist for almost all of his life. So he rejected, but he like the training.
You can take the boy out of church, but you can't take the church out of the boy.
Exactly. And they couldn't, because he converted to Catholicism shortly before his death. I mean, to be fair, he'd had a severe stroke by then, and his memory was pretty fucked. But he still converted. He was still saved.
Oh, good on him. Good on him.
Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah. So, in terms of how this holds up in 2024, I think I've said a lot of how I feel about it, in that his descriptions of New Dealism are probably a quite accurate descriptions of how America and much of the Western world would end up going. I don't think his predictions of of just the complete overrunning of everything in society by managerial technical relations really came true.
No, he was wrong about that, and he was also wrong about, because he did predict that Germany would win the war, didn't he? I know that I have that in my head, but I
believe
don't
he did.
remember I don't remember where he says it. It's like, so I'm not sure
I
if it's something
think it's in the
I've read
section where
secondhand or yeah.
no, I think it's in the section where he's talking about where the centers of power in the future are going to be, and he says, based on which parts of the world are the most technically advanced and the most managerially advanced, I think you're going to have 3 or 4 centers of power. One of them is going to be in Europe, centered on Germany as the most powerful managerial state there. Then you'll have one in Russia, so Eurasia. You're going to have one in East Asia, centered on Japan, and then you're going to have the United States, which will be the final managerial power. And I'm pretty sure it's in there where he predicts that Germany will win the war, or at least heavily implies it when he says that Germany will be the center of power in Europe.
Yeah, okay. And it's worth, that reminds me, it's worth saying that for those of you who have read George Orwell's 1984, the book within the book, Emmanuel Goldstein's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, was explicitly modeled on and drawn from Burnham's The Managerial Revolution. Like Orwell just took Burnham and just put him in that book. So that's historically interesting.
That's brilliant metatextual analysis. The postmodernist before postmodernism was cool.
Yeah, so like, I mean, like
doing a J.G. Ballard and taking other people's works and then putting your name on it and saying that it's art.
Exactly. Exactly.
Always found absolutely hilarious.
But just a thief. So like the predictions he makes, so like especially because he puts timelines on his predictions. So it's definitely, it was not a complete managerial society by 1960. That didn't happen, and in fact, government control receded after the war, which makes sense. So the US won the war. A complete managerial society did not eventuate, and government as a percentage of GDP, if you just take that measure, receded again. Not to anywhere like earlier, not like World War One levels, or pre-World War One levels, but quite down again. So he's wrong about that. What are the other concrete predictions that he makes? Because like in the general, in the vibe of the thing, you can kind of agree with him. Like there is much more of an international, or sets of competing international elites, international military alliances. That's all true. It is a much more managerial society. The managers have like a lot of like bureaucracies. They've proliferated wildly. Quasi-governmental and quasi-governmental institutions have proliferated wildly. It's not in any sense a laissez-faire capitalist society of the kind he describes as being a truly capitalist society, especially like prior to World War One. But what else does he predict that either did or did not come true? I'm just trying to think of like a concrete prediction he made.
This is tangentially related to what you said. It was more, what I think is probably the most interesting part of this book is he points out that formal ownership and day-to-day management are being separated, at least in capitalist countries. And that process has continued, and to a large extent deepened, although it has become more complex with things like, for example, employees being paid in shares in part. So that does muddy the argument about the disjunction between ownership and control.
Yeah.
And also his predictions as to where the disjunction between ownership and control would lead didn't eventuate. So they didn't eventuate in the managers eventually as a class abstractly realizing their own power and overthrowing finance capitalists. Instead, it just got weirder. Finance got weirder and more abstract.
Yeah.
Management became more bureaucratic and Byzantine.
Yeah.
I guess part of it is a lot of his predictions are very, very, I wouldn't say necessarily monotonic, but almost, as in logically, one group becoming more powerful inevitably leads to them seizing control at the complete expense of competing groups. Whereas instead, a number of the trends that he correctly identified have just led to things becoming much more murky and complicated rather than having one clear ruling class dominating everyone else, or the shifting of ruling classes based on the relationship to the means of production.
Yeah, and I think look the association. What one thing he sort of like couldn't, I mean, didn't predict and possibly couldn't predict is sort of like the ambiguous relationship between Well, okay, he says that technology as technology becomes increasingly complex, it'll move further and further away from the workers' control because it's too complex for them to control. But what he wouldn't have anticipated is like the way that a lot of technology has sort of boomeranged around, such that now the barriers to entry for someone with very little capital are a lot lower in a lot of domains. So, like, if we were trying to record this podcast in 1970, we would need all kinds of complex equipment that we couldn't possibly operate. But now, like, so now technology has been made so user friendly that it's actually quite not easy, but it's way more accessible for someone to do a lot of complex things by themselves, because the cost of technology and the ease of use has become so straightforward. And like, with AI now, like, a lot of people can be so much more effective, I don't know, content producers and stuff like that. Like it's you got so much technological complexity that is, you can get the benefit of it without even understanding it, because it's been refined into such a user-friendly format. So you actually get like a lot of bespoke and very niche, I guess, economic enterprises springing up, and that's sort of empowering worker hyphen capitalists.
Yeah, it's a really good point that when he saw the increasing complexity of technology, which has only continued, he assumed that the complexity of the underlying technology tracks with how difficult it is to use, whereas that's a user interface problem, which is related but actually separable from the problem of how complex the underlying technology is.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
do
you have much more to say about this book? No.
Well, I mean, I thought I just thought it might be interesting to see what Burnham later said of this book. So, I'll just look. I've got a book. I'll just read you a paragraph. I've got a book from a study of him in the 1980s by an acolyte of his named Samuel Francis, who would actually expand on Burnham's theories. But this book, but Samuel Francis will say for another day, because I haven't read it yet, and neither has Jack. But he wrote a long book released in, I think, the late 90s or 2007 that sort of updated Burnham's Managerial Revolution theory. But anyway, he was the first person to put out like a monograph on James Burnham in the 1980s. And it's a really good introduction to James Burnham. So I'll read you a paragraph. Burnham in 1959, which was, I guess, 18 years after the Managerial Revolution. And by that time, he was definitely like a mature conservative. Okay, Burnham in 1959 felt that his predictions of the replacement of the nation-state system by a small group of superstates had been fulfilled, if not by Germany, Japan, and the United States, then by the Soviet Union and the United States, as had his predictions of a protracted conflict between the superstates for control of the world. Moreover, the two superstates sought to organize their power bases through transnational, regional, or geographical blocks: NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the Common Market, and Comecon, the United Nations Organization. Again, it is possible to argue that Burnham's original predictions had not been fulfilled, but he seems to have discerned correctly an important vector of modern history. By the 1990s, although the Soviet Union had disintegrated, the trend towards transnational, regional, and even global unification was obvious in such pacts and organizations as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, WTO, the European Union, reliance on the United Nations for peacekeeping missions and other functions traditionally performed by independent nation states, and the perpetuation and expansion of NATO. And he definitely, so that's what he thought was correct. I think we've alluded to what he thought was incorrect, and he explicitly rejects a bunch of it. But he thought that, like, and this can, like, he never got rid of his preoccupation with the idea of a managerial elite. It's just he modified it. And so this is a quote from Burnham from 1951, 10 years after the publication of the Managerial Revolution. Quote, "The people who point these errors out don't bother to point out how many predictions were right. It's easy enough to avoid mistakes in prediction by never saying anything definite about any problem. I could do that, but I'm not interested in playing safe. I'm interested in a problem and in an answer. I think that's serious, don't you?" And he did acknowledge a lot of the problems, but yeah, so, and he yeah, that's all I want to read from that. But he rejects his own analysis pretty soon after in the Machiavellians, but his overall preoccupations, I guess, he rejects a lot of the theory and the logic of his own book, but he keeps a sense of, like, the vibes and the broad themes, I guess, later on.
Yeah, and it's not like this is a bad book. It's just I think his own description of it as a transitional work is really, really accurate.
Yeah.
It's him between different stages of his intellectual life.
Mm.
And that's probably where a large part of the confusion within the book comes from.
Yeah.
In terms of whether I'd recommend it or not, I reckon it might be worth reading the first few chapters where he in general lays out his idea of the managerial revolution.
Yeah.
But so much of it is so informed by a theory of history which I don't think actually reflects reality, that quite a bit of it is probably not very worthwhile as well. So I'm a bit mixed on it. It is saved by things like him writing very well. He writes extremely clearly, which is really nice.
I think, I mean, it's one of the things about this book is it's out of all of Burnham's books, and probably compared to a lot of social theory texts in general, it is cited a lot. And it is it's one of those books that's sort of like at least within probably those dealing with political economy or sociology, it has a, it's reference to this day, and even in academic world, I think, but also in popular culture, and because it's got such it's such a dramatic theory that it's quite attractive to a lot of people. I don't think I find like the early Burnham, like the Managerial Revolution and even the Machiavellians, like they don't quite have his mature writing style yet. Like I think it's really like after 1959 or something, and especially in the 1960s, that you get like this much funnier and ironic and dry Burnham. He's always dry, but he retains the clarity of his writing, but like stylistically, he becomes much more funny and cutting towards the end of his life. And I really think that only happens really towards the end of his life. Like, I would say only like one of his books is actually quite is a great literary work, I would say. Another book, like Congress in the American Tradition, 1959, his second last major work, is really good as an intellectual piece of work. And then Suicide of the West, which is 1964, is like a great literary work as well as an interesting political work. And then his columns in National Review are often like, when he was responding to real events, are like much more accessible and, well, just a lot funnier. Like he just, I don't know, became much more sardonic and witty and all that kind of stuff. It's like I wouldn't recommend the Managerial Revolution to anyone who didn't just have a peculiar interest in it as a work in a time and place. As you said, probably the first few chapters would be more than sufficient, but I would, for anyone interested in James Burnham, I'd start elsewhere, but I think people really just like the idea of the Managerial Revolution, and it's his most starkly dramatic sort of overarching monocausal social theory kind of book, and so that's going to appeal to a certain type of person.
Yeah, it appeals very, very strongly, it seems, to people who spend a lot of time on Twitter. to the point where the Managerial Revolution contained within his book is quite markedly different from the concept of the Managerial Revolution as it has mutated in the wild since he wrote this book.
Yeah.
And I imagine that also goes quite a way towards explaining why this seems to be the work of his that attracts the most attention, even though I really don't think it's the best thing he's done.
No. Yeah, and he definitely didn't think it was the best thing he'd done. Yeah, he thought it was pretty shit in the end. I read you passages of him like defending some of it to an extent, but like he didn't really take it seriously. I don't think if James Burnham was wanting you to understand James Burnham, he probably wouldn't have recommended the Managerial Revolution. He would have recommended the Machiavellians, which was only 2 years later, and then all the books that came after that.
All right, I don't have much more to say about it. It is very late at night for Ed.
Yep. Well, it's 20 to 11. We've got through this faster than I might have anticipated, so I haven't completely lost the sense of myself, and I think I've remained relatively coherent. So yeah. But no, I don't have anything else to add on the Managerial Revolution. Yeah, I'm sure I'll be back to talk about some more Burnham books at some point, because it's a minor passion of mine.
All right, thanks for listening. See you next time.